Of all the 7 Oxfraud reasons, this is the big one. The assumption is, of course, that William Shakespeare's candidacy is supported by evidence, and I will keep looking for it. This slide shows 7 links between Edward de Vere and the works of Shakespeare. I won't repeat the commentary here. You can find it under the Constructing Fantasies tab on this site. In his biography of William Shakespeare, the critic Sir Jonathan Bate wrote, "Gathering what we can from his plays and poems, that is how we will write a biography that is true to him." This statement acknowledges a widely recognized truth, that a writer's work reflects his milieu, his experiences, his thoughts, and his own personality. Or, as Sir Paul said about his creativity, "When I write, I'm just writing a song, but I think themes do come up, you can't help it. Whatever's important to you finds its way in. You really can't help it, 'cause it's you making all the marks on it." So, with apologies for my dreadful Scouse accent, let's begin. Believing you know the absolute truth when presented with a set of incomplete documents that require interpretation causes problems. The mind has an innate mechanism designed to create blind spots to data that contradict what one believes to be absolutely true. It's most healthy to frame a conversation in terms of better and worse arguments, rather than in terms of "this is true" until you prove absolutely otherwise. This video presents a series of coincidences which form the basis of circumstantial evidence, and both cases for authorship, that is de Vere and Shakespeare, are circumstantial. Shakespeare's being based on ambiguous posthumous source evidence, the only author since the invention of the printing press for whom that is true. Contrary to the claims of Oxfraudians, in criminal cases, circumstantial evidence is often regarded as more powerful and persuasive than the testimony of a single eyewitness. If the circumstantial case, composed of so-called coincidences, is powerful, it can overcome a single eyewitness's testimony. Suppose you tell jurors that a man is a murderer, and you have one bit of evidence. The suspect is known to have worn Ferragamo shoes, and the defendant wears Ferragamo shoes. Of course, they would look at you strangely. Suppose you tell jurors that a man is a murderer, and you have one bit of evidence. The suspect was seen to be thin and tall, with long red hair. You say that the defendant is thin and tall, with long red hair. Again, they would not be convinced. Suppose you tell jurors that a man is a murderer, and you have one bit of evidence. The suspect is known to have left the scene in a white '65 Mustang with bald tyres. They would still not be convinced based on a single piece of evidence. It still could be a coincidence, because many people may fit that criterion. But suppose you told the jurors that the murderer wore Ferragamo shoes, was tall and thin with red hair, and drove a white '65 Mustang with bald tyres, and the defendant fits all of these criteria. Now you would have a case worth pursuing. Because circumstantial evidence is so persuasive when properly applied, Oxfraudians must find ways to weaken the circumstantial case. They do this by dividing up the coincidences and emphasizing the fact that there are only coincidences, attempting to keep people from seeing them all put together. Circumstantial evidence works like the pointillist painter Seurat. Is this dot on the canvas the image? No. How about this dot? No. How about this one? No. But once you have enough dots, the image emerges, and only someone with an agenda tries to argue against the obvious pattern that is forming. In this investigation, the approach is simple. The plays and poems constitute a crime scene. We must examine the crime scene to help generate profiles of two suspects. What follows is not proof. There is no proof, because there is no smoking gun when it comes to the authorship question. Both candidates have only circumstantial evidence to support them. The question to ask yourselves is, which makes the stronger case for being the author? William of Stratford or Edward de Vere? In this particular case, I'll follow a special procedure, one in which much of the evidence for the Oxfordian case will rely on hostile witnesses, Stratfordian scholars, i.e. those who believe the author is William Shakespeare from Stratford. We'll look at 7 categories of evidence as they apply to the crime scene, which is the poems and plays of a writer called Shakespeare. The image from the first folio represents the writer Shakespeare. Our first step is to ask, what do Stratfordian scholars say about the writer Shakespeare? Next, I'll try to see what kind of evidence exists that forms a William of Stratford connection to these categories. I'll use this original engraving of the Stratford monument to represent William of Stratford. Finally, we look for the evidence that connects to Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Along the way, please note something special about the kind of connections we're examining. These are the kinds of connections that in some way are idiosyncratic and intimate, often to the state of consciousness of the person. The intimacy of the connections is what's so profound about the circumstantial case. I invite proponents of William of Stratford, Marlowe and Bacon and all others to devise similar presentations for comparison. This is sometimes called the 7 levels of argument, and I will avoid the bottom 3, that is, name-calling, ad hominem, and responding to tone. You'll find those in abundance on the Oxfraud site. I'll begin with characters in Hamlet. First of all, the Shakespeare connection. We have William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, as Polonius, and in the interest of time I won't read all the slides in their entirety, but encourage you to pause the playback if you would like to read everything on each slide. Hostile witness, Stratfordian, A.L. Rowse, in his book William Shakespeare, a Biography. Nor do I think we need hesitate to see reflections of old Lord Burleigh in old Polonius. Skipping ahead to the 1966 quote here, Reader's Encyclopedia of Shakespeare, Burleigh is being satirized as Polonius in Hamlet. These aren't the 2 only instances, by the way. For every slide that I put up, there are many, many more pieces of evidence, but there just isn't time to go over every one. So these are connections with the works of an author called Shakespeare. Continuing, Hamlet, Ophelia, and Cecil. Here's a Stratfordian who says, in red, and Cecil, the fair Ophelia of the play. And Cecil, is William Cecil's daughter. So we have established here at the crime scene Shakespeare the writer was connected to William Cecil and his daughter Anne. Looking at William of Stratford's connections to these two people, they don't exist. There is a Hamlet connection to Shakespeare, mind you, because William had a son, Hamlet, named after his neighbour Hamlet Sadler, and some Stratfordians see Hamlet as a memorial to that son. When de Vere's father died, Edward became the ward of William Cecil and lived and was educated in his house. He was married to the model for Fair Ophelia. I invite you to pause to read the entire slide, but I will go on at this point. Lillian Winstanley, a Stratfordian, a hostile witness, says there is a further curious parallel in the fact that when Cecil's daughter married de Vere, Earl of Oxford, the husband turned sulky, separated himself from his wife, and declared it was Cecil's fault for influencing his wife against him. And she draws the parallel. So, also in the drama we find Polonius interfering with his daughter and her lover. We find his machinations so successful that Hamlet turns sulky and is alienated from Ophelia for good. How about the parallel of the Earl of Oxford as Hamlet? I'll let the movie run, but not read the lines. Edward de Vere's brother-in-law, Peregrine Bertie, Lord Willoughby, served as a royal emissary to the Danish court at Elsinore in 1582, where he recorded his own personal experiences with Danish drinking rituals that are preserved in Hamlet, and his bread-breaking with Danish courtiers named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Recorded on those fascinating little studded pages are the brother-in-law's personal notes of his Elsinorean exploits with the Danish king and his court. None of this material would have been available outside the Queen's inner circle or the company of Bertie's immediate family and friends, a group that included de Vere. This material came in the form of personal letters written to de Vere. Anyone in London can walk into the British Library and see the documents for themselves. The shelf mark is Cotton MSS Titus C7. That's Latin. Romans 7. I'm repeating myself on this slide, and I add a reference for anyone who would like to verify the information. I cannot find photos or transcripts online. I call this topical events, but will give only one in the interest of keeping this video as short as possible. This is the so-called bed trick. In All's Well That Ends Well, Bertram arrives at Diana's bed, not knowing that he is in reality sleeping with Helena. Quoting hostile witness and Stratfordian G.K. Hunter, editor of the Arden All's Well That Ends Well, the last great Earl of Oxford, whose lady was brought to his bed under the notion of his mistress, and from such a virtuous deceit she is said to proceed. Stratford connection to anything topical? None we know of. Now we go on to Shakespeare's library and books. This book by Stuart Gillespie contains nearly 200 entries covering the full range of literature Shakespeare was acquainted with, including classical, historical, religious, and contemporary works. Hugh Trevor Roper, in What's in a Name, said, "No scholar today would see Shakespeare as a mere child of nature. On the contrary, we realize that he was highly educated, even erudite. It is true he does not parade his learning. He is clearly familiar in an easy and assured manner with the wide learning of his time, and had the general intellectual formation of a cultivated man of the Renaissance." Once again, in the interest of time, I will mention just 4 of the books that scholars cite as sources for Shakespeare's plays: the Geneva Bible, Ovid's Metamorphoses, the Courtier, and Cardanus' Comfort. A general point here with the Stratford connection. There is no known connection. No evidence exists that William had a library, nor did he leave books in his will, as others have done, in an age where books were so valuable that they were chained to desks. Stratfordians suggest that William borrowed printers' copies of books from publisher Richard Field while living in London, but there is no evidence that he had access to such books in Stratford. In comparison with the Oxford connection, A.L. Rowse, Stratfordian, says, "As a royal ward, Oxford was taken into that school of virtue, Cecil House in the Strand. Here, under the surveillance of the great man, Edward was placed under the direction of a succession of tutors. For the first couple of years his uncle Golding, then the remarkable scholar Lawrence Nowell, for a time the no less scholarly Sir Thomas Smith. Young Oxford was sent only briefly to St. John's College, Cambridge, Burleigh's own, but he emerged from this training well educated, with literary interests and of good promise, considering that along with his rank. If any library could be said to be worthy of Shakespeare, one can easily say that Cecil's qualified." Let's start with those 4 books. Shakespeare's library, the Geneva Bible. Which English Bible did Shakespeare use? I'm going to skip over some of these lines. You can pause to read them. It became accepted that up to 1598 Shakespeare's biblical references were primarily to the Bishop's Bible, but after that to the Geneva Bible. Shakespeare's connection to the Geneva Bible, no known connection. Oxford's connection to the Geneva Bible. B.M. Ward, in his biography, the 17th Earl of Oxford, says, "Payment was made for a Geneva Bible." Again, I will skip over the rest of the lines. You may pause to read them. Shakespeare connection to Ovid's Metamorphoses. Stratfordian, Jonathan Bate, again, in Shakespeare and Ovid, if Shakespeare and his contemporaries owed their intimacy with Ovidian rhetoric to the grammar schools, their easy familiarity with Ovidian narrative was as much due to Golding. Golding was the translator. Connection to Shakespeare? No known connection. Orthodox scholars speculate that William read Golding at the Stratford Grammar School, but there's no record that William attended this school. Oxford connection. The translator Arthur Golding was Oxford's uncle, and they both lived in William Cecil's household in the earlier years that Golding spent translating Ovid. Part of Oxford's early education was an in-depth 2-hour per day study of Latin. Castiglione's The Courtier, Shakespeare connection. Orthodox scholar Drayton Henderson, in the Everyman edition of The Courtier, without Castiglione we should not have Hamlet. But it is not only Shakespeare's Hamlet that seems to follow Castiglione. Shakespeare himself does. Shakspere's connection to Castiglione's the courtier? No known connection. Oxford's connection to the courtier. In 1572, Oxford wrote the Latin preface to the Latin translation of the Courtier by Bartholomew Clark, his tutor at Cambridge. And again, I'll skip over the remaining lines. And finally, Cardanus Comfort, Shakespeare connection. Stratfordian Hardin Craig, in his article Hamlet's Book, writes, "The correspondences between Hamlet and Cardanus Comfort are really very close, indicating that the Shakespearean passages in question did actually come by suggestion or borrowing from Cardanus Comfort, rather than from any of the numerous other writings from which they might have been derived." Shakespeare connection? No known connection. Oxford connection to Cardanus Comfort. Thomas Bedingfield's 1571 translation of Cardanus Comfort was dedicated to Oxford. We go on to topic number 4, which is in 4 parts: law, music, power, and Italy. Connection to Shakespeare. Knowledge of law. There's very little disagreement that the author was deeply knowledgeable regarding the law. Stratfordian Senator Cushman Davis in The Law in Shakespeare. Where such knowledge is unexampled in writers unlearned in the law, Shakespeare appears in perfect possession of it. J. Anthony Burton in the Shakespeare newsletter. In Hamlet there is a consistent and coherent pattern of legal allusions to defeated expectations of inheritance, which applies to every major character. Who else, after all, but lawyers and law students would appreciate the gravedigger's parody of legal reasoning in a 40-year-old decision written in the corrupted version of Norman English known as Law French? Knowledge of law connected to Shakespeare? No known connection. The record shows that William had some experience with lawsuits and property, but no record shows that William attended or was associated with Gray's Inn or engaged in legal activity as a lawyer. Connection to Oxford. Knowledge of law. Oxford matriculated at Gray's Inn, a law school, although there's no evidence of residency, and in his position as a Premier Earl, he sat as a judge on state trials, including both the Mary Queen of Scots trial and the Essex trial. At least one of Oxford's tutors was an acknowledged scholar in civil law, Sir Thomas Smith, who tutored Oxford from the age of 4 to 12. Smith did not see law as a technical sideline, but rather an integrated part of one's education. Oxford was raised in the most legal political house in England, and Cecil was noted for encouraging the nobility to have a thorough education for the good of the country. Knowledge of music. Connection to Shakespeare. Stratfordian E.W. Naylor says, "It is scarcely a matter of surprise, therefore, that the musical student should look in Shakespeare for music, and find it treated of from several points of view, completely and accurately." There follows another quote here, which I will skip, and you can pause to read it. Shakespeare's knowledge of music? No known connection. Knowledge of music connection for Oxford. Oxford was known as an accomplished musician and patron of music. John Farmer dedicated 2 music books to him, 2 musical works bearing his name, the Earl of Oxford's March and the Earl of Oxford's Galliard may have been composed by him. Knowledge of power. Connection to Shakespeare. Adolf Pearl, former ambassador and special assistant to the Secretary of State under President Kennedy, in his book Power, his treatment of modern political power in its myriad manifestations, writes, "One wonders what the personal reveries of a Plantagenet or Tudor dictator must have been. Shakespeare probably gives a better analysis than historians. His pictures of the breakdown of Macbeth, of Richard II, and of Richard III are more convincing than most historical studies. Perhaps the best education a power holder could have would be a solid acquaintance with Shakespeare's plays." Knowledge of power. Connection to Shakespeare. No known connection. He's never mentioned in the company of power holders or being present in court. Knowledge of power. Connection to Oxford. A.L. Rowse writes, "The 17th Earl of Oxford was, as the numbering shows, immensely aristocratic, and this was the clue to his career in Elizabethan society, full of new and upcoming men, some of them at the very top, like the Bacons and Cecils. The Boleyns themselves, from whom the Queen descended, were a new family. The Oxford earldom stood out as the oldest in the land. He was the premier earl, and, as hereditary Lord Great Chamberlain, took place on the right hand of the Queen, and bore the sword of state before her." Knowledge of Italy. Connection to Shakespeare. Stratfordian and Italian Ernesto Grillo, in Shakespeare and Italy, writes, "Shakespeare evinces a varied and profound knowledge of the country in general, and of our cities in particular. Innumerable are the passages where he speaks of special characteristics of our peninsula, of her history, and of her customs. He knew that Padua, with all its learning, was under the protection of Venice, and that Mantua was not. The various scenes in Othello are no mere Venetian reminiscences, but pictures exhaling the very spirit of Venice, which Shakespeare has transferred to his drama." Knowledge of Italy. Connection to Shakespeare. No known connection, and there's no evidence he ever left England. Knowledge of Italy. Connection to Oxford. Of the 16 months Oxford travelled the continent, 10 were spent in Upper Italy, primarily in Venice, Padua, Milan, and Florence. Knowledge of Italy. Continued. Connection to Oxford. Shakespeare plays with locations in or excessive references to. Again, I won't read them all. You can pause the video. Now let's move on to Shakespeare's fellow poets. Connection to Shakespeare. Stratfordian Charles Boyce writes, "Author of works that influenced Shakespeare, Spenser's monumental epic poem The Faerie Queen provided the playwright with the inspiration for many passages, especially in the earlier plays and poems." Edmund Spenser. Connection to Shakespeare. No known connection. Spenser died in 1599, well within the time of Shakespeare's fame as a poet and playwright. They were the two great poets of that decade. Yet Spenser never mentions William of Stratford, and William never mentions Spenser. Edmund Spenser. Connection to Oxford. In The Faerie Queen, Spenser dedicates a sonnet to Oxford that stands above the other 16 in its astonishing deferment to Oxford's special relationship to the Heliconian imps, the offspring of the 9 Muses, a relationship that would be reserved for someone of Shakespeare's stature. Spenser and Oxford were nearly exact contemporaries. The poet John Lilly connection to Shakespeare. Stratfordian R. Warwick Bond in the complete works of John Lilly. In the essay in the second volume on Lilly as a playwright, I have endeavoured to show how Shakespeare is indebted to our author, not merely for phrases, similes or ideas, but also in the more important matter of dramatic technique. Once again, pause the video to read the second paragraph. John Lilly's connection to Shakespeare, no known connection. Lilly never mentions William, nor does William ever mention Lilly. Lilly's connection to Oxford. John Lilly was Oxford's secretary. He dedicated Euphues and his England to Oxford. They worked together in producing plays. Poet Anthony Munday's connection to Shakespeare. Samuel Schönbaum writes, on one occasion, however, so the evidence indicates, Shakespeare was called upon to doctor a play written by other hands for which company is uncertain. That play survives in damaged and chaotic shape in a manuscript with the title The Book of Sir Thomas More, in its original form a fair copy by Anthony Munday. Anthony Munday connection to Shakespeare, no known connection. Munday never mentions William, nor does William ever mention Munday. Munday's connection to Oxford. Munday worked for Oxford, who was his patron, dedicated several of his works to Oxford, and joined Oxford's acting troupe, Oxford's Men. Language and accolades. Word creation connection to Shakespeare. I'll make this brief and put Shakespeare and Oxford together on one slide with one example of one word creation. Please pause to read in detail. Literary accolades. There's an enormous number of contemporary accolades to Shakespeare the author, but not one of them is personal. This is a critical point. Every reference is of an impersonal nature, such as a review or literary criticism. No one, while he was alive, said anything about William Shakespeare being a poet, playwright, or author of any kind. And as I pointed out in the Constructing Fantasies section of this site, Shakespeare is the only author since the invention of the printing press for whom all the evidence of authorship is posthumous. No unambiguous primary source evidence of him being a poet, playwright exists. Full stop. Using Diana Price's list of 24 contemporaries for whom we do have evidence that they were indeed authors, next slide. Remember this slide? 10 literary paper trails shown at the top show from 3 to 10 check marks for 24 poet-playwrights, yet none for Shakespeare. Is this proof Shakespeare wasn't the author? No, but I'm not looking for proof. I'm making a case for one argument being stronger than another. This slide shows what happens if you take the number of check marks for each of the authors and turns them into data. 10 refers to 10 check marks for Ben Jonson, and 3 at the end of the row of data points will be Christopher Marlowe. The other 22 authors are in between. The statistical results are in red. Look at how small the probability is for an author of the time not having at least one piece of documentation, 0.3%. literary accolades for Oxford. There are many. I won't read through this. Pause to read. Finally, the Shakespeare dedicatees. The three dedicatees are Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, and his brother Philip Herbert, Earl of Montgomery. Henry Wriothesley was the dedicatee for the two works that first bore the name William Shakespeare. That's two poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, in 1593 and 1594. Brothers William and Philip Herbert were the most noble and incomparable pair of brethren to whom the first folio of the complete works of Shakespeare was dedicated in 1623. Let's look at Shakespeare's connection to Henry Wriothesley. No known connection. We have no evidence as to when, where, or under what circumstances William Shakespeare first met the Earl of Southampton. We have only conjectures, and Samuel Schoenbaum admits that even though William willed items to his fellows Hemmings, Burbage, and Cundall, he strangely neglects to mention Southampton. Is there a connection to Oxford with Henry Wriothesley? Well, Lord Burleigh sought a marriage between Southampton and Oxford's daughter Elizabeth Vere at the time Venus and Adonis was published, dedicated to Southampton, as I said. Some Stratfordians believe that the marriage sonnets were written at this time. What's the William Shakespeare connection to William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke? No known connection. Pembroke never mentions William, and William doesn't ever mention Pembroke. What's the William Herbert connection to Oxford? Pembroke was at one time in negotiations with Lord Burleigh to marry Oxford's daughter, Bridget Vere. Let's move on to Philip Herbert and his connection to Shakespeare. There is no known connection. Montgomery never mentions William, nor does William ever mention Montgomery. Is there a Montgomery connection to Oxford? Well, the Earl of Montgomery, Philip Herbert, married Oxford's daughter, Susan Vere. Scholars often speculate how the unpublished plays in the first folio got into the hands of the publishers. It's reasonable to think that if the author's daughter were married to someone associated with the first folio, that would be a likely means of transmittal. Susan Vere is the likely conduit for the transfer of the Shakespeare manuscripts to Montgomery and hence to the publishers. This is the end of this very long video, and I want to repeat that it was never my intention to try and prove anything. I wanted to make two arguments and let the viewer decide which is the stronger in this crime scene with two suspects. I do want to give credit, though, to much of this video coming from Mark Alexander's PowerPoint presentation, from which I borrowed heavily. Thank you very much, Mark.